Welcome to BI493 Biology Research Experience. This is our fourth online class. Today, I want to look at how you are going to present a paper. When we look at our goals of presenting a paper, we want to present the paper in a way that conveys that you understand the research and that you have made a critical analysis of this research. You want to avoid pulling information directly from the paper. You need to put things in your own words as you're presenting your primary literature. Also, you need to know the paper thoroughly enough to answer questions related to the study that you're presenting. So when we look at the organization of the paper or presentation, much like in most work, you want to have an introduction. You then want to let your audience know what the question being asked in the paper is. It is not unusual that there's really more than one question, and so you need to give your audience an idea of what those questions are. You next want to talk about the experiments that are being done and the methods. You then are going to show the results from the paper. You're going to show graphs and figures and tables, describe them, and interpret them for your audience. And finally, you are going to draw conclusions and say, what does the data lead one to conclude? When we think about the presentation introduction, we want to provide background information on the subject. Start with more general information on the subject, and then move towards more detailed information in your specific question. So you start out with general background, and you focus into specifics. You have a very short time for your presentation. The audience will have read your paper beforehand, so you do not want to spend too much time on the presentation. There's a real balancing act in doing a short presentation. You basically have 15 minutes to convey to the audience what the question was, what was the design of the experiments, what were the results, and how do those results lead to a conclusion. And so when one takes a look at a presentation, one is going to spend most of their time making sure the audience knows the question, understands experiments, sees the results, and sees conclusions. Talking about the results and conclusions should be about 75% of your talk. Your introduction about 5%. Question and experiments, about 20%. If you spend too much time on the introduction questions and experiments, then you will not be able to demonstrate mastery of the paper, nor lead the audience to see what were the important results and conclusions drawn. So when we look at the questions, after your introduction, you do want to lead into, as you are narrowing in to more specifics in that introduction, to stating what the question of the study was. You also want to state the author's hypotheses. And you want to give a little idea of why the study is important. When you talk about methods, you do not want to get into the nitty-gritty. The audience doesn't need to hear buffers, specific steps. Really what they need to know is experimental rationale. What is it that you're observing, and why are those observations going to lead to being able to draw a conclusion? Right? Is the experimental design strong? Are there appropriate controls? How will the experiment test the hypothesis is something that you must convey to the audience. You need to make sure that you understand all the methods, the ins and outs. You may get questions in the question answer period, but in the presentation proper, the nitty-gritty is what needed. You do, if it's important, need to talk about statistical analysis. Do not quote directly from the paper. Put the experimental design in your own words. Results and interpretation. Unlike a scientific paper where you separate results and conclusions, that is, it's a no-no to include interpretation, in results of a paper. I'm sure the paper that you're going to present has separated them. In presentations, we do that. In fact, in a short period, if you want your audience to understand results and conclusions, when you talk about one experiment, it really is valuable to discuss the conclusion. If you go from one result to another, to another, to another, and then say, well, this result shows that, that result shows that, the audience will be lost. They will not be able to remember, and they will not have the data right in front of them to go to a conclusion. Discuss one figure, one table, and then give an interpretation and move on to the next. Take your time in explaining results. Notice 75% is results and interpretation. Your final discussion will be fairly short because you will have done most of that work of discussion in this results interpretation. So make sure your audience knows and sees how the data leads to an interpretation. Explain each graph what each graph shows, and why what it shows is important. Pointing. To important data in a graph or a table is well worth the time. It slows you down and it helps your audience to see exactly what you're trying to say is important. Your discussion will be relatively short. What you're going to do is you're going to come back and you're going to say what the main results are. And you're going to try to put them into a context. If you think there are alternative interpretations from what the authors gave, you need to point out that you see a contradiction. Again, quickly point to the main evidence. You want to say why you think the paper is important. You also want to say, are the conclusions as great as the authors touted? In other words, authors always try to convince you that their work is more valuable than it likely is. And finally, you want to put this study in a context of what you're doing and how it relates to other work done in the field. Throughout your presentation, if there's a strength or a weakness in the paper, point it out at that time. Think critically. Over the years, we have devised several hints to help you to make a more successful presentation. Slides serve two purposes. Good slides amplify and clarify the message. You don't want them to be too busy. They are going to help the audience listen to you and see what you're saying. In this way, slides are an outline. They help keep you on track. Choose colors carefully. You don't want your slides to be distracting. Background pictures and other things like that usually are a negative. Be consistent in your color scheme. Font size counts. If people can't read your slide, then why have it? Notice, then you cannot put lots of information into a slide and just read slides. Slides are an outline. You need to know the material to talk about it. Use only landscape format. Text. See the impact of size? The rule of 6. Figures and pictures should be large enough to see clearly. Again, if you can't read the graph or read the table, why show it? Sometimes you may want to cut a table from a paper into subsections for your slides so that people will be able to read them. It is also okay to redo tables in which then you put important data and take out some of the trivial data. They should always be of good quality. You can pull figures from a paper, right? And as I said, you can modify and highlight specific areas. So you can pull a figure out of a paper and put an arrow in so that you highlight an important area that your audience sees it immediately. Talk to your audience. Try not to read. Use a pointer or point to things. Try to stimulate your audience. Don't walk too much. Moving a little is okay, but don't jog back and forth across the room. 3 to 7 minutes a slide is a good pace. Again, early speakers or early presentations, people usually race through them. You need to enable your audience time to absorb what you say. So think about pace. Nervous? No doubt about it. So prepare notes, but don't depend on them. Your slides can serve as your notes. They serve for notes for me and most faculty members that I talk to who use PowerPoints say that they use their notes as cues to what they want to talk about. So they need to know the material. Rehearse. Have a glass of water available. Focus on a friendly person in the audience. Kendra Cipollini has one rule. Prepare, 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 prepare. If you are well prepared, you will do a good job.